There's a woman outside Asheville who's lived in her tiny home on the same half-acre for 7 years. Same county, same officials, 0 fines, 0 red tags. Her neighbor down the road bought an almost identical build, parked it on family land, and had a code enforcement notice taped to the door in 17 days. Same lifestyle, same size house, completely different outcome. Tonight, you get all 7 things she and people like her know that keep them legal, plus the 5 mistakes that get tiny homes reported, including one that looks responsible on the surface but is actually the fastest way to bring a code enforcement truck down your driveway. Now, you might be watching this because you already own a tiny home, or you're mid-build, or you're just weighing the idea and want to know what you'd actually be walking into. Maybe you've heard the horror stories about people losing their homes over a zoning technicality they never saw coming. Either way, the people who've done this right didn't learn it from a blog post. They learned it from county officials, from inspections, and in some cases from watching a neighbor lose everything over a paperwork mistake. So let's start with the decision that determines everything else that follows. Number 1, know your classification before you buy. Here's something almost nobody figures out until it's too late. A tiny home isn't one thing in the eyes of the law. Built on a trailer chassis and certified to RV standards, it's treated like an RV. Built to residential building code and permanently affixed to a foundation, it's treated like a house, or, in a lot of counties now, like an accessory dwelling unit. And a tiny home that's neither something somebody built in a driveway without certification is treated like nothing, which means it has no legal category to hide inside when someone starts asking questions. People who've done this successfully for years say the classification question comes before the floor plan, before the land, before anything else, because it decides every rule that follows. One man in Oregon who's had his build on a foundation for 5 years put it simply. He said the day he got his ANSI certification paperwork in hand was the day his tiny home stopped being a target and started being a house. Same structure, same square footage, same everything, different piece of paper, completely different legal standing. The mistake almost everyone makes is falling in love with a floor plan on Pinterest and only asking, wait, what is this legally after they've already bought it? By then, the classification is locked in, and so is whatever category of scrutiny comes attached to it. But even a perfectly classified tiny home fails if it sits on the wrong land. Number 2, the zoning ladder. People who live legally in tiny homes rank land the way investors rank assets. And at the top of that ladder sits a category almost nobody considers first. Family land with an accessory dwelling unit ordinance already on the books. If a relative owns a residential lot in a county that permits ADUS, a certified tiny home can sit there as a second legal dwelling, inspected, permitted, done. Nobody drives by wondering if it belongs. It's simply the guest house. One rung down, dedicated tiny home communities and RV parks zoned for long-term occupancy. These exist specifically to hold tiny homes, so the land itself has already answered the zoning question for you. Then come RV resorts and campgrounds that allow extended stays, which work fine for RVIA certified builds but come with time limits that vary wildly by state. Some cap you at 90 days, others let you stay a full year before you have to move on. And then there's the option beginners reach for first. Buying a cheap plot of raw land and just parking on it, it's fading fast. More counties every year are closing the loophole that let a tiny home sit on bare land indefinitely without a foundation or utility hookups. And the ones that haven't closed it yet are watching neighboring counties do it and taking notes. A woman who's owned 5 acres in rural Texas for 8 years said the single best thing she ever did was call the county planning office before she bought the land, not after. Most people, she said, call after. They've already got a tiny home sitting on a trailer in their driveway, and by then the answer they get back is a lot less friendly. But even the right land can turn on you if the home sitting on it doesn't look like it belongs there. Number 3, look like the county expects you to look. Ask yourself something. When was the last time you drove past a house with skirting around the base, a proper address number by the door, and a covered porch, and thought anything at all? You didn't. Your brain filed it under house and moved on. People who live legally in tiny homes learned that code enforcement officers make the exact same snap judgment from the street, and the ones who understand this lean into it hard. Skirting around the trailer wheels or foundation, so from the curb it reads as a house with a low profile, not a trailer with a roof on it. A visible address number, because an address number is the single strongest visual signal that a structure is a recognized dwelling and not a vehicle waiting to be moved along. Steps, and a small deck instead of a fold-down RV ladder. Utility lines run underground or through a proper conduit instead of an extension cord snaking across the grass. Every one of those details whispers the same message. This is a residence. Meanwhile, the tiny home still sitting on its trailer hitch, wheels exposed, extension cord visible, no skirting anywhere, is shouting the opposite message. This is temporary, and temporary is exactly what draws a second look. A code enforcement officer driving a routine route isn't stopping to inspect paperwork from the road. They're scanning for what looks settled versus what looks parked. The skirted, address-numbered build gets a glance and nothing more. The one still on wheels gets a knock. One builder in Colorado, who's had the same tiny home on family land for 6 years, said he spent $400 on skirting and a proper address sign the week he moved in, and considers it the single best money he's spent on the entire project. 0 complaints since. The visual read gets you past a glance. What happens when someone actually checks your hookups is a different test entirely. Number 4, utility discipline. Here's a detail that catches almost everyone off guard. In most counties, it isn't the tiny home itself that triggers an inspection. It's the hookups. No visible power source, no water line, and a mystery about where the waste goes is the fastest way to get a sanitation department involved. And unlike a zoning question, a sewage question moves fast. People who've done this legally for years treat utilities as the paperwork that protects everything else. A proper electrical hookup tied into the main panel with a permit, not extension cords hidden under a tarp. A real water line, tapped or tanked and documented. A septic solution that's actually been inspected, whether that's tying into an existing system, a permitted composting toilet, or a proper new line. The trap is going off-grid quietly to skip the permit process entirely. It feels like independence. To an inspector, it looks like a structure nobody can verify is safe, and that guarantees a follow-up visit. A couple in Washington state said the septic inspection was the single most expensive part of their setup, and also the one piece of paperwork that made every other question from the county disappear. Which brings us to the rule that ties all of this together, the paperwork itself. Number 5, the paper trail rule. If there's one habit that separates the tiny homeowners who sleep easy from the ones checking the mailbox nervously, it's this. They treat documentation like insurance, not a hoop to jump through once and forget. Building permit, utility permits, certification paperwork, proof of foundation, all kept together, physical copies at home and a scanned set somewhere else. Code enforcement almost never opens with an inspection. It opens with a complaint, usually from a neighbor, then a records check. Permit on file, and the visit is often a formality. Nothing on file, and it becomes an open-ended investigation, because now the officer has to figure out what they're looking at instead of just verifying it. One woman in North Carolina keeps a folder taped inside her kitchen cabinet with every permit and sign-off. She's shown it to a code officer exactly once in year 2, and never had a single question since. She calls it her Leave Me Alone folder. The mistake beginners make is assuming that once a permit is granted, the process is over. It isn't. Permits expire, ordinances change, and the county that approved you 5 years ago may have quietly rewritten the rules since. Number 6, read the ordinance yourself. Don't trust the forum. Nobody who's done this successfully for years made their citing decision based on a Facebook group or a comment section. They made it based on the actual zoning ordinance, read cover to cover, for the specific county and specific parcel they were considering. Because here's the trap. Tiny home rules aren't just different state to state, they're often different county to county within the same state, and sometimes different from one side of a city line to the other. What's perfectly legal 2 miles away can be a violation on your parcel, and the only way to know for certain is the document itself, not secondhand advice from someone in a different jurisdiction entirely. The habit that separates the ones who stay legal from the ones who get blindsided is simple. Before buying land, they call the county planning and zoning office directly, ask for the ordinance language in writing, and read the actual definitions. So, not is a tiny home allowed, which gets a vague answer, but specific questions. What's the minimum square footage for a dwelling? Is a trailer-mounted structure classified as an RV or a residence? Is there an ADU ordinance? What's the setback requirement from the property line? Vague questions get vague answers. Specific questions get answers you can actually act on. One builder in rural Georgia said he called 4 different counties before choosing land, and the ordinance language varied so much between them that a plan rejected outright in one county was welcomed with open arms 15 miles away in another. He said the $50 zoning packet he ordered from the county office was the best investment he made before ever pouring a foundation. Even the best researched siting decision, though, can still unravel over something that has nothing to do with paperwork at all: the people next door. Number 7, the neighbor relationship. Here's a fact that surprises almost everyone new to this. In the overwhelming majority of cases, code enforcement doesn't go looking for tiny homes. Someone calls them. A neighbor sees something unfamiliar, gets curious or annoyed, and picks up the phone. Which means the single biggest variable in whether a perfectly legal tiny home ever gets a visit isn't the county, isn't the ordinance, isn't even the paperwork. It's the person living next door. People who've done this for years treat the neighbor relationship as part of the setup, not an afterthought. A short conversation before the build even arrives, explaining what it is, that it's permitted, and roughly what to expect during construction, heads off most of the confusion that turns into a complaint. Some go further, inviting a neighbor to see the inside once it's finished, which turns a mystery structure into a known quantity. A tiny home nobody's ever seen inside stays a rumor. A tiny home a neighbor has actually walked through stops being interesting. The ones who get reported are almost always the ones who treated the build as none of anyone else's business, kept to themselves, and let the neighbors fill in the blanks, and blanks tend to get filled with the least generous explanation available. A man in rural Tennessee who's had his tiny home on family land for 9 years without a single complaint said the only thing he did differently from the neighbor who got shut down was walk over with a six-pack the week the foundation went in and explain what was happening. 20 minutes, he said. That saved him. In his words, probably 5 headaches he'll never know he avoided. So, those are the 7. Classification, land, appearance, utilities, paperwork, the ordinance itself, and the people next door. Get all 7 right and a tiny home becomes just another house on the street. But nearly invisible and invisible aren't the same thing, because there are 5 mistakes that can undo every one of these in a matter of weeks. And the first is the mistake almost every new owner makes before they've even moved in. Mistake number 1, skipping the permit to save time. Picture the scene. You found the land, you've got the build ready, and the county's permitting process is going to take 6 to 8 weeks of paperwork and inspections. So you make a call almost every first-time owner has made at least once. You'll just move in now and handle the permit later. Nobody's going to notice for a few weeks anyway. Except, that decision doesn't just delay the paperwork, it changes what you are in the eyes of the county. A tiny home with a permit in process is a project. A tiny home already occupied with no permit on file is a violation, full stop. And in a lot of counties, occupying a dwelling before a certificate of occupancy is issued triggers a stop work order and sometimes a fine on its own, completely separate from any zoning question. You've turned a temporary delay into a permanent mark on the record for that address. One owner in Idaho who now mentors first-time builders said he's watched 3 separate people move in early to save 2 or 3 weeks, and every one of them ended up spending months untangling the violation that followed, far longer than the wait they were trying to avoid. He put it simply. The county doesn't care why you moved in early. They only care that you did. The fix is almost embarrassingly simple. Wait for the paper before you sleep there for the first night. Mistake number 2, choosing the wrong zoning without realizing it. This is the mistake that catches people who did everything else right. They got the permit process started. They researched the build. They picked land that looked perfect, quiet, affordable, a nice patch of grass in a residential neighborhood. What they didn't check is whether that specific zone actually allows a second dwelling on the lot at all. Here's the trap. A lot of counties zone land as strictly single-family residential, meaning exactly 1 dwelling per parcel, full stop, no ADU ordinance, no exceptions for a family member's tiny home in the backyard, no matter how permitted or well-built it is. The land can look identical to the parcel 2 streets over that does allow it. Same size, same neighborhood, same price range. But one has an ordinance on the books permitting a second unit, and the other doesn't, and nothing about looking at the land tells you which one you're standing on. A woman in a suburb outside Sacramento found out the hard way. Permit paperwork submitted, build already purchased, only to be told her specific parcel's zoning code capped it at one residential structure, period. She spent over a year fighting for a zoning variance that was never guaranteed to succeed. The fix connects straight back to Rule 6. The ordinance has to be read for the exact parcel, not the county in general, before any money changes hands. Mistake number 3, visible non-compliance. And this is the one I warned you about at the start, the mistake that looks completely harmless. You've got the permit, you've got the right zoning, everything's legal on paper, so you figure the small stuff doesn't matter. The extension cord running across the yard instead of a proper buried line, because the real hookup is scheduled for next month. The propane tank sitting exposed instead of screened in. The trailer wheels still visible because skirting is next on the list. From inside your own head, none of this is a violation. It's a temporary detail on a home you know is fully permitted. From the street, it reads as something else entirely. Exactly the unfinished setup that makes a neighbor pick up the phone. And here's the part that surprises people. A neighbor doesn't call code enforcement because they checked your paperwork and found a problem. They call because it looks wrong. The visual is the trigger, not the legal status. A builder in Colorado said he got his first and only complaint call not over anything structural, but because a cord ran across visible grass for 11 days while he waited on an electrician. The officer who showed up told him flat out, the paperwork's fine, the neighbor just didn't like the look of it. The fix is treating the visual finish as part of move-in, not a someday project. Mistake number 4, overstaying a temporary permit. Somebody finds a great arrangement, a temporary permit, a seasonal RV park spot, a 90-day allowance while the real build gets finished elsewhere. Month 1, fine. Month 2, still fine. By month 4, the same tiny home that was welcomed as a short-term guest has quietly become a long-term resident nobody approved, and the permit on file no longer matches what's actually sitting on the land. Here's the trap with temporary permits specifically. They don't fail loudly. Nobody comes to tell you the clock ran out. And unlike a first-time violation, an overstayed temporary permit tends to read as intentional. Someone who knew the rule and pushed past it anyway, which gets treated more harshly than an honest zoning mistake. A woman who spent what was supposed to be one summer in an RV park outside Flagstaff said she watched 3 separate owners get served notices over 2 years. Everyone because a 90-day stay quietly became a year without anyone renewing the paperwork. The permit has a date on it, she said, whether you're paying attention or not. Mistake number 5, arguing with the code enforcement officer. Because someday, even doing everything right, that knock comes anyway. And how the next 10 minutes go depends almost entirely on one choice, whether you treat it as a conversation or a fight. The mistake is meeting the officer at the door already defensive, quoting ordinance sections through the screen, demanding to know who complained. Owners who've been through it say that's exactly backwards. The officer usually isn't hunting for a violation. They're closing out a complaint or checking a box. Invite them in, show them the folder, let them see the permit and the sign-offs all in one place, and they leave with paperwork in hand. Argue instead, and you invite a much closer look. A structure that seemed fine at a glance suddenly gets measured and cross-checked against every line of the ordinance. A tiny homeowner in rural Missouri who mentors new builders said he's watched it go both ways with 2 nearly identical setups. One owner invited the officer in, walked through the paperwork calmly. 8 minutes, done. The other got defensive at the door, and a 5-minute check turned into a 4-hour inspection that found 3 unrelated issues nobody had flagged before. Same county, same rules, completely different afternoon. So those are the 5 mistakes. Skipping the permit, misreading the zoning, letting the small visible details slide, overstaying, and turning a routine visit into a standoff. Step back far enough, and you can see all 12 of these are really one principal wearing different clothes. Know exactly what you legally are before you buy. Put it in writing. Make the outside match the paperwork. Treat the neighbors like part of the plan, not an afterthought. And if someone ever does knock, hand them the folder and let the paper do the talking. The people who've mastered this weren't trying to outsmart anyone. They were just trying to build a stable, legal home in a system that wasn't originally built with tiny homes in mind. But what they figured out about preparation, documentation, and playing it straight applies to a lot more than tiny homes. which is exactly why there's a video linked right now on what off-grid cabin owners know about staying legal that most people never think to ask about. That one pairs with this perfectly. Go watch it.